so far? So far what we were writing, we were logging into vendor, we were logging into Acme website, we were logging into, after that we were navigating, and after that we were doing the data processing, and after that we continued with doing all the other functionalities, right? So but in real time, what is going to happen? In real time, it will not be that scenario. In real time, it is going to be like login will be worked on by one person. Maybe the navigation, if it's a bigger project, the navigation functionality might be worked on by another person, and then another functionality would be worked on by another candidate, and then another functionality, right? So you'll have split between your work. So, or you yourself can be working with different XAML files and integrating together. So how do you do this in this particular UiPath Studio, right? So for example, let's take this functionality. Now we are logging into Acme, right? So how do we actually do the login? Every time I need to write the code for login. Either you can create it as a reusable component, or you can create it as a separate XAML file, and you can copy the XAML file everywhere. Okay, so if your project is using particular same login functionality, what you can do is you can create that as a library. That is the best option. Otherwise, what we do is we also say, okay, you can copy the XAML file from one folder location to another folder location. That also is possible. Okay, but usually the library option is preferred. But if you want to do it the other way also, that is also possible. So what are we supposed to do? So here in the main file, what I'm going to do is, let me create a new process. Right, the same functionality that we did last week. Whatever we have done, I'm going to do the same thing. But what I'm going to do is, instead of writing it in the main page, I'm going to have different XAML files for each functionality. Okay, so when I say for each functionality I'm going to have different XAML files, then your parent file is main.xaml file, right? So what you need to do, from the main.xaml file only, you're going to call each of the XAML files. Okay, so that you will make sure the main files gets directly interacted to your proper other XAML files. So this is how you will be doing. So for example, if you have, these are called calling submodules. Okay, so if you have, suppose two boxes, say this is your main XAML file, and you have a XAML file called login, and you have a XAML file called navigation. So what you can do, you can connect main from login, and if suppose the login functionality is done, you have to connect back to the main, you have to give the control back to the main.xaml file, and then from there you have to connect to the other functionality, which is navigation.xaml file. Okay, so this is one way of doing, from main to login, then come back to main, and from main to navigation. This is one way. Suppose if login and the navigation are interconnected, then what you can do, you can first come back to login, from main to login, and then login to navigation, and then come back to main. So this is what we are going to do. So all these boxes are dependent on what is your project requirement. So however you want to choose, you can define, but usually you have to come back to your main and then only invoke the next file of your main functionality. Okay, so this is what we are going to do. So when we are talking about invoking, okay, so we are talking about crawling a new information. So what we are going to do is, we are going to call it using the data. You have to pass data between pages, right? You have to pass data. If suppose login is the functionality, from my main workflow I need to pass the username and password field, right? Otherwise it will not work. So how am I going to pass data? So how is that? I will be passing the data, and I will be choosing the information between page, or I will be sending information between pages. So this is what we will be seeing in today's class. Okay, so for us to first understand what we are going to do, so let me say, I'm not sure if I can draw boxes. Say suppose this is your main.xaml file. Okay, from this main.xaml file, I'm going to take another file which will be the login. XAML. Okay, from this I will be taking it back. Or if I have another functionality which will say login, login retry. Okay, say another functionality comes in as login retry, and then we have something called navigation. So how does it actually do? So from here you have to connect to first the login, and from the login I'm going to connect back. So basically if this is right. So basically what is going to happen, I'm first going to start the program. So when I start the program, I will say from main, first I need to do the login functionality. So from main, I'm going to call the login XAML file. Again from the login, now while I'm calling the login, what is the information I'm going to give? I'm going to say, no, I have the information called username and password. So I need to pass this information, right? So once I say username and password is passed on, these are the information I need to pass from my main XAML file to a different XAML file, right? So these two information now I will pass. So after passing it here, now my login functionality, I'll write the code for my login functionality. From there, if suppose you need to have another calling, so what this will do, the login failed, so it will call this particular option, the login retry. Now this will say, okay, login retry, it has done yes, no, and everything. It might be passing some information back, and it might be passing. So here after doing the login, now what I'll do, I'll be saying, okay, I have logged in. I'm going to say, I have logged in. Okay, now I have logged in. I'm going to say login is equal to success, right? So I have to say to somebody that it is success. Only then I can, if I say this is going to be success. Okay, so if I say success, then what it will do? It will do the next step, that it will connect to the next activity. So if the first activity is completed, now what it will do? It will go and connect to the next activity. So this activity might require some inputs, right? So this is how your invoke workflow will work. So basically you will have the first piece of code which will say invoke this particular login.xaml file and pass this information. Okay, now once this is passed over and this is executing, it might be calling this particular file, and after this particular file is done, the information, so here also there is going to be another. So from here, once this particular information is done, it will come here. And after this, this particular information will be coming here back. So when it is coming back, it might be doing a success flag or something, it might be passing. So you can pass information between variables for its working better. So for it to work better. So that is what we do in the invoke, or that is what we do. So that what will happen, your main file will be having only the login, calling of the login file, calling of the navigation file. But whereas when you go inside, the functionality of login and calling of the login retry will be there. So this is what we will do in your invoke workflow. Okay. Now what are the information that I'm passing here? I'm passing username and password. Only if I, so main, actually what happens when you're having everything, your main only will be having your information. Correct? So you're going to have all the corresponding variables set in the main file, right? So as a default, you have to use all your corresponding variables, all the basic variables that the project is going to use will be set up in the main file. So from here, what you're going to do, which means even the username password will be mentioned here, right? So from here, what you're going to do is you're going to pass the information that is relevant to this particular functionality. So in this case, the relevant information is nothing but username and password. So you have to pass this information. So how it will be stored here? It will be stored as variables. And when you're passing, you're going to call it with a different name and with a different, and you're going to understand how we are going to do. Okay. So once you pass the information, now this information will use the username and password, do the functionality, and then it is going to say, okay, I'm going to continue for to log in retry.xaml file to do something, and then it will give back, and then it has to give back an acknowledgement which says yes, the login flag has been success, or the login has been a failure. So whatever it will do, it will give a output back, so that the main.xaml file can continue with the next step, that it will go to the navigation process. So this is how we will be doing. Okay, so how we will be doing, based we will use a activity called invoke workflow. Okay, now this is your main.xaml file. Okay, now consider that in your main.xaml file, or let me take a very individual, very easy example. Let's take, okay, say suppose you have let's take an easy example of, I want to do addition of two numbers. Okay, now I have two numbers in the main file. Now I'm going to take it to a new file and I'm going to say add this number, right? So the functionality or the processing of the addition of two numbers, the functionality that I'm going to do, the processing that I'm going to do is going to be addition of two numbers. That I don't want to do in the main file. I want to do it in a new file, in a new that somebody else is doing. So I need to integrate my data so that they will be able to successfully complete the processing. Correct? Yeah. So this is what we are going to do. So here what I'll say, the easiest example we'll take is using number modification, I mean number manipulation. Okay. So let me put a flowchart, and in the flowchart I'm going to say assign number one. Okay, so I'm going to have two assigns, and here I'm going to say number one is an integer. Okay, so similarly number two is an integer, and I'm going to have something called, okay, let me leave it. So it is going to be number one. So here I'm going to say number one is equal to say 20. Okay, and I have another assign which is going to be called as number two is equal to 30. What I'm going to do is I'm going to do the addition not here, in a different file. So for me to first create a different file, what I need to do, go to new. You can create it as a flowchart or you can create it as a sequence. Usually we create it as a flowchart based on branching statements. Now since we are just going to do addition, we are just taking, I'm just taking a sequence. Okay, so go create a sequence. So this is going to be add number dot, so add number. If I give the add number, it will create. So what it created? It created our add number.xaml file. Okay. Now what does this particular XAML file require? I'm going to do addition. So I will say, suppose this is your result. Okay, this is integer. So I need to say result is equal to number one plus number two. Right? But where is this number one and number two information? We do not have the number one and number two informations here. So which means you have to first pass the information from here to here. Correct? So for me to pass the information, I have something called arguments. Okay? So whenever I'm going to pass, oh, it is not coming now. So whenever I need to pass the information, okay, so when I need to pass information from one file to another, I'm going to call it as an argument, okay. So what is an argument? Argument is going to be exactly the same as a variable. But when I use the variable and while passing also I use a variable, you will also get confused, the program also will get confused, right? So for that we have a naming convention called argument. So what does an argument do? Argument will be the same as the variable, except it will have a direction along with it. Okay, so which means if I am sending username and password to this, so this is the actual XAML file I'm going to invoke, actual XAML file I'm going to call, correct? So if I'm sending username and password to this, then I will say username is the argument, password is the argument, and it is going in the in direction. So what will happen? This directly go in the in direction. Okay, now you are passing the information. Now after passing the information from here to here also you are passing information, there will be another argument. So now from here you are getting the login success flag, right? So now this is going to be in the direction out. Okay, so arguments are nothing but same as variables, except that they have an additional parameter called direction. So there are three directions. You have in, out, and another direction called in/out. Okay, so what is an in? Anything that is going, you have to consider the whichever file that you're going to invoke. So this is the login file that I'm going to call. This is the login file I'm going to call, means to this file, in which direction does the parameters go. So these two information are going as input. So you call it as in the in direction. This information is coming out of the XAML file to the main file. So this is called in the out direction. So this is the output of this particular file. So you call it as out direction. If the same information is modified going as input and coming as output, then you call it as in/out. Okay, so this is how we will be doing. So in this case, so where do we go and set the arguments? We set the arguments in the page, in the variable panel called arguments. Okay, so here the argument is going to be the same. So if you say this is the variable, okay, now tell me the information. Now I'm going to pass these two information, number one and number two, and I'm going to do the result. So which means, can I say result also I should display in the main? I can display the result here, or I need to bring the result back to the main page and I need to display, right? So this will be the information. So according to me, I am going to use the number one and number two as the input arguments for add number, and result will be the output argument which will go to the main file. So here what I'm going to do, I'm going to show this as an argument. So let's consider the first scenario. So this is not going to be result. So let me go ahead and delete. Okay. So what am I going to do here? So basically you have got a XAML file, and in this XAML file we are going to have result. We need the result and we need number one and number two. Okay. So what I'll do is I'll create arguments called number one and number two. Okay, I'm not sure how much you will get it, but I'll just brief it to you and then we'll do an explanation. So what I'm going to do is, so let me say this is num1 plus num2. Okay, so what I'm going to do here is I'm going to create arguments. So go to the not in the variable panel, go to the argument and say for the first argument I'm going to get is the input, correct? So I'm going to get number one as the input. So what is the direction of the thing? I'm getting it into the file. So this is in the in direction, and this is going to be the integer format that will come, right? So here I'm passing number one and number two. So number one, number two, which is coming from main file to the login file. So here I'm going to say this is number one, this is number two. So this is in the in direction. So here again num2. This is in the in direction. This is also integer, right? So now you have got something, and then you are going to have result, right? So result again could be either you can put it as a variable or you can put it as an argument. If you put it as a variable, you cannot pass this to the main file. But in our case, what do we require? We need to pass this result to the main file, right? So we need to pass this information also back. So for that, I'm going to create another argument called result. But what is the direction it is going to be? It is going to be in the out direction, which means it is going as output, right? In, out, in, out. Property is a different scenario, right? So we are going to say out, and this also I'm going to change it as integer. Okay, so now I've got two inputs which are arguments to this particular file. So to whichever file you're going to pass the information, that file only direction you have to see. So if it is coming as, so open that particular file. If you receive some information from other files in the direction, if you're receiving some information, you have to call it as in. If you're sending some information, you call it as out. So your base is your, this particular XAML file which you're actually modifying. Okay, your base is not the main file. Your base is going to be the file that you are modifying, to which you need inputs, to which you need, you're going to send output, right? So after this, I'm going to save. If I don't save, my code changes will not get reflected. So here I'm going to change. So here what I'm going to do is, now I've taken number one, number two, and result. So next I'm going to go, this, that's it, right? So I know what is number, I need to receive number one and number two, and I need to send, after receiving, I need to send the result to the output, right? So to whichever page which is going to call this functionality. So which means main page is going to call the add number XAML file, right? So to the whichever function, whichever page that we are going to call, we are going to use the invoke workflow. So you go and type invoke workflow. Okay, and you copy this particular function here. So now I'm going to, I have two numbers. I'm going to pass this particular two numbers here. Okay, so that is what I'm doing here. So what, I'll double click on this invoke workflow, and I'll say, since I saved it, now this is in my project structure. So open this browse file, and you're going to say add number. Okay, now you're invoking. You have already called. Now you have to pass between the numbers, right? So here you have to pass number one and number two, and you have to choose the modification. So I'm going to go ahead and say import arguments, right? So this is what will be your information here. Now this is your add numbers information. So this is the input of, or this is the file related to the new workflow. And this is what you're going to say is, what should this value be added to? Okay. So for example, in our case, what we are going to do is, number one is directly equal to number one of your main.xaml file, correct? So number one has 30, 20, right? So number one has to be equated here. So what I'm going to put it, I'm going to say, so now what will happen? Whatever was there in the main number one will get written to number one of the argument in your main, in your new XAML file. Okay. And then this is going to be number two. And then you're creating result. So result is an output, correct? So it is coming out. But we need to also receive we need to also have a variable to store that particular result. Now it is coming from this page to this page, right? So similarly, what number one and number two is going from this page to number one and number two of that particular page. So you stored it, right? So the result is going to be from this page, it is coming here. So you have to store it somewhere, right? So you have to create a new information called result. What I'll do is, instead of creating it as new result, I'll put it as main result. Okay. We'll do it as main result. Okay. So what will happen? Anytime the first number one and number two will get selected, whatever is in your main file will get selected, and it will go and sit on number one, number two of the argument. Okay. So what happens from this file to this file I'm passing? So it is going to be called as argument. Okay. Whenever you are coming back something, you need not create it as an argument. In main, always you need not create it as an argument. Always everything can be there as variable. That is the functionality of main file. Okay. Only in the other files you're going to create it as an argument. Okay. here in the main file, you're going to always have it as variable only. No arguments will be created in the main file, right? So what we did was I passed in the number 1 and number 2. This is your main file's functionality. This is the values from which you're going to call the workflow. This is the values for the workflow that you are calling. Okay, so this is the values of add number. This is the values of main, right? So in add number, number 1 should be equal to mains number 1. In add number, number 2 is equal to mains number 2. Similarly, in add number result, you're going to have a result, so it should be equated in the main file also, so that it will store the value somewhere. So main result will be the variable that I will create. So once I create this particular information will go. After this, I can simply say I did the addition there, but here I can go and display the result set. So here I can go ahead and say I'm going to display main result. If I say I'm going to display result, it will not come. Okay, but if I'm going to say I have copied that particular information from result to main result, then it will come. Okay, so if I execute this, now the functionality will go between different files and it will come back. So if you see, the functionality is now saying it has gone to the add number and then it did the calculation. Again, it came back to the main page and now it is displaying. Okay, so what do you need to remember? Whenever you are going to pass some information, that information is going to be called as, if you're calling this particular file from main file, then in the input arguments, you're going to open this. In this particular file, you have to create arguments. If you're passing some information, username and password, you need to create arguments for username and password. Okay, so that you treat it as input and output. So you receive information and you send information. Once you receive information, so there is username and password here also. That information only you're getting sent here, right? So similarly, if you have a information that needs to be sent here, you need to have a variable name to copy that information or to hold that information. Okay, so this is what we will be doing in the Invoke workflow. This is a simple example of the Invoke workflow. Okay, so any questions here? So let's continue with understanding this particular functionality. So now what we are going to do in real time, we will be having a one main file, and in the main file you will be calling invoke, multiple functionalities will be invoked. So this is what we will be doing. You will be seeing very less coding in the main file and multiple invokes will be there in the main file. Okay. So what we'll do is, with respect to your Acme website, we'll do a particular particular exercise so that we can understand this concept, right? So let me go ahead and do with the Acme website. Right, so I'm going to say only the login functionality, I'm going to bring it to something else. Okay, so let me say I'm going to bring in a flowchart. Then I'm going to say start. After getting a start, I'm going to actually take username and the password, right? I'll create two variables called username and password. String, this is flowchart. I'll say this is the username. Why to pass username and password? We'll just directly go ahead and enter. No, so why to pass it from here? You can pass it from here, or you can take it directly into your login functionality. So let me say it as username password. Okay, say suppose this is the thing. So I'm first going to do the login functionality. So the moment I'm going to start, I'm going to say, okay, I'm going to start with your login functionality and I'm going to continue with whatever I need to do, open browser or whatever. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I need to start the program, right? So when I start the program, what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, I'm going to call first activity itself will be the login only, correct? So what we are going to do is we'll say invoke workflow login. Okay, so in this particular thing, you cannot add because you have to create the new file. So let's go and create a new flowchart. I'm going to do branching, so I'm creating a new flowchart. So this is login Acme. Let me put it as login. Okay, so now I'm creating a new login file. So here what I'm going to do, I'm going to say open browser. Do I need to do an open browser here or here? If I do it here. Let's see if this works. If it doesn't work, then we'll see. So I'll put a message box, we shall say, because I cannot keep the do section empty. We'll put a message box. See, browser. Okay. Now after this, what am I doing? I'm going to go to the invoke workflow. So now I'm going to come back to the login and I'm going to say type into this particular field, type into this particular field. So now I'll say message box login functionality invoked. Okay, so here we are going to bring in type into. So before going to this particular thing, we need to attach a browser, right? You're shifting the focus from this particular thing to this particular thing. So you have to do an attached browser. Even without attached browser, it should work to my knowledge. Indicate browser, and this is your browser screen. So attach browser. Now you're going to talk type into. Type into username. Okay, so here when you're going to type into username, what are we going to do? We are going to say you're typing into username. What you need to type? You need to type the information that is there from this particular thing, right? So in the main file, you have something called username and password. So this is going to be called as an sent as an input to this particular file. So which means I need to create two arguments called username and input. Sorry, username and password. So always when you create arguments, you are going to say it as the direction followed by the argument. So the moment you read the argument name itself, you'll know it is going to this particular file in this particular direction. So it is going to be in underscore username. Okay, now it is in the in direction string. Now I'm going to get even the password. So it is going to be in underscore password. Okay, so now what is going to happen? The moment I call this particular file, username will be coming and username will be sitting over here. So I can simply say in underscore username. Another type into, which will say indicate element password. Right, so this is going to be in underscore password. Right, so now this is done, and then we are going to click on a mouse button. Click on login. Okay, so here what is going to happen? After clicking on this particular step, it will go to the next page. So now this page will be loaded. So here what I'm going to do is, I'm going to say whether the login is success or not. How can I say? Can I say if the login is success if this page is loaded? If this page is loaded, I'll say the login is success. If this page is not loaded, I'll say login is not success. Correct? So what I'm going to do is, I'm going to say I'm going to take every time when you see, when a particular, in real time, when you're going to say page loading, you're going to deal with multiple pages. Okay. So at that time, what we are going to do is, we are going to see if the any particular element has been loaded. I mean, all the elements have been loaded in the page or not. Okay. Did the entire page load or not is what you will be seeing. Only if it is loaded, you can proceed, right? If it is not loaded and I go without vendors being loaded, I cannot go and click on vendors. Correct. So you need to first make sure that the page is loaded or not. So how can I check the page is loaded or not? I need to take a unique element of the page. Okay. So usually you can say whether the entire page is loaded or not, or you can check if a unique element is loaded in the page or not. So if you see this particular area, okay, dashboard keeps changing for every vendor, search for vendor. So if you see, the rest of the elements also might be changing, but this element has changed. So similarly, if I go for display all vendors, now this will change to vendor search results. So if you see, this particular area is changing everywhere. So can I say, what I'll do is, I'll take this as the unique element. So if I say, if the dashboard field is loaded, that means my page is loaded. Or you can take the last element. If this element is loaded, then you can say the entire page is loaded. Okay, you can do it either way. In Acme website, this might not work. So what I'm going to do is, I'm going to take the unique element. So unique element of a page, unique element of a page, and you can say if that particular element has been loaded, then you'll say the entire page has been loaded. So you can check like this also. Okay. So I'm going to say if that unique element has been loaded. So how can I check that? I'm going to check that using element exist. Okay. So now I'm going to say here, right? So inside this, I'm going to say if element exists. So element exists is the activity which you need to search for particular element, whether it is existing or not. So you'll go and say element exist, click on the indicate browser, and you say if this element exists, or you can also say if the copyright information, that element is loaded, then you can say the page has been loaded. I am taking dashboard. Okay. So I'll say if element exists. Okay. So when I say if this particular element exists, then it means the page has been loaded. Correct. So this is what I'm going to say. So what I'm going to do is, if element exists means it will return a Boolean information. It will return yes, the element exists, or no, the element does not exist. So it means it is going to return some information. Okay. So that is a true or false that it will return. So I'll create a Boolean flag which will say dashboard flag. Okay. Now I have to say whether the dashboard flag is. So if you see in the variables page, it will be created as a dashboard flag Boolean. Okay. But what am I passing in the information? I'm passing username, and I'm passing out the flag also, which means this should not be a variable. This should be created as a argument. Correct. So here I will go and convert this into a argument. So I click and convert to argument. So automatically it will go and create as an argument. Now I'm going to say no, this particular information I'm going to create it as an out parameter. Okay. So here also I'll change the name to out underscore dashboard. Right. So here I'm going to check this. So if the element has loaded, then I'm going to say instead of this, what we'll do is we'll create this as variable only. If we see, this particular information from the main file will be going as input parameters to the other file. From there, we are going to receive the flag information that we have set up here. Okay, so this flag information, I'm going to pass it out, right? So I do a save, only then it will get reflected, right? So now I'm going to do the linking. Okay, so how am I going to do the linking? I'll go to the main, invoke workflow, click on the workflow thing, login. The moment I click on import arguments, if you have values, it will get automatically sitting there. Okay, sometimes automatically it will come and sit. Okay, so what is your username? The username of the argument is going to be equal to the username of the main field. So you can go and say main sample file. You can simply go and say username, and then this is going to be password. So this is going to be username.toString. This is going to be password dot toString. If there is no error, then give it as password. Okay. Now you are going to have a dashboard flag which you are going to receive as which you're going to receive from that information. So you say, okay, dashboard flag. So this is going to be dashboard flag. This is going to be Boolean. Right. So now what I'm going to do, I'm going to say I'm receiving the dashboard. So whatever I passed from here is going as username dot to password and username and password. Now it will go and sit in the corresponding in variables. Now whatever I'm going to receive as output from this particular file will come and sit in the dashboard flag. Okay. So always if you have three information that you're expecting, say three inputs that you're going to pass, where is the file? If you're going to have two inputs and one output that you're going to receive to main, these information should be in main also, this information should be there in the child also. Okay. So in the child, it will be there as arguments, in the main, it will be there, or in the parent, it will be there as variables. That's it. So if you are going to have 10 information sent over, the 10 information will be here as arguments, as input. And that 10 information will be here as variables because you're sending this 10 information only into this particular file. So similarly, if from this particular file, if you're receiving 10 information, or this particular file is sending 10 into information out, to store this 10 information, you need to have in the parent 10 variables so that the 10 information gets stored here. So this is what we do it as the mapping. Okay, generally. So now what I'm going to do, I have invoked the workflow, there is no error. Now I'm going to do the condition check, flow decision. Okay, so if the dashboard flag is true, then I will continue with the navigation. So if dashboard flag, right? So dashboard flag is true, then I will say continue to navigation. Login success, proceed to next steps. Right? So if it is false, then I will say no, it is false. So you can put a if also and you can check. Since I wanted to make it more presentable, I'm using a flowchart. So here you can say login unsuccessful. So now what will happen? This particular file will open and it will call the login functionality. And from the login functionality, the username and password fields will be entered. And then it will come back and do this particular operation. So after this, if you need to do the navigation, again, you will have an invoke workflow and do the navigation related stuff. Okay. So you'll do the navigation related stuff saying navigation navigate.xaml, you'll create a new navigate.xaml. What you'll do, you'll start using an attached browser. So here we are in this particular thing, right? So here what I need to do is I will be creating another XAML file, which will say flowchart. I'll say navigate. So in the navigate, what I'm going to do, I'm going to create from this page. So I'll say browser, attach browser from this particular page. I'll say click on vendors. And then click on search for vendor. Okay, now it will go to this particular page. And then I'll say display all vendors. So click on. right? So it will take me to display all vendors. So this particular page has no input. I'm not receiving any input or I'm not receiving any output. So I can just leave it like that. Just do a save, and in the main I need to go back and say invoke navigate.xaml file. I can still have 0 arguments. It is not necessary in every file need to have an argument. So now what it will do? It will do all this and it will stop here. So after this, what I can say, just simply go and log out. So here I can simply put a logout functionality, or you can do a data scraping. Or if you're doing data processing, then you create a separate workflow to create data processing, and you can grab this particular data and you can stop it there. Say suppose if you want to grab this particular data, I'll do a data scraping wizard and I'll say click on this. Yes, your data is now scraped. Finish. There is no paging. So now your data scraping is done. So this gets converted into an extract data table. So here you change the scope to flowchart. Okay, and then you can click on logout. So here what I'll do, I'll click on logout. So another click, and I'm going to say in this particular page, I'm going to click on logout. So what it will do, the first thing, it will open the browser, then it will call the login functionality. Now the login functionality will execute. It will pass the dashboard flag. This is how you will be generally doing the coding. Okay. So we will be passing between. So each file will make sure that it is synced. Okay. So we will make sure there is a flag between when you navigate to the next page. So we check the navigation. If the navigation has failed, then you have to put a information called error handling. If not, you will say it is false. Right now we are just putting as a message box, but usually we will put it as an error handling method. That when we learn error handling, we'll go to that particular area. Then if it is true, it says login successful. Go to navigation. So this is your navigation information, right? So this is your navigation invoke. So what it will do, it will invoke the navigation. So it will invoke the navigation workflow, and after the navigation workflow is invoked, it will do the data scraping, and then it will finally log out. Okay, so invoke workflow is very, very simple as long as you understand this particular information. If you have three information that it is going to receive, then all the three information needs to be going as input to this particular thing. So whichever file you are going to have as a invoking file, that file will be your actually base for your in and out. So if you're receiving something, then it will be in. If you're sending something, then it will be out. So whatever information you're receiving, if you're receiving it as an argument, then you have to have something in the main file, or if you're sending something from login to login retry, if suppose you are sending even username here. So what will happen, username will be here also, username will be here also, but here it will be as a variable, here it will be as a input argument. Okay, so you have to have, if you have three arguments in the parent file, you have to have three variables to store those three arguments, store the values of three arguments. Okay, so however you have, so you might be sending username and password which is stored to this, but from here you might be receiving the flag. So then you will store. So basically you've sent the stored value, and from there you are receiving the flag information. So this is what will be your invoke workflow. Okay, so let me see if this particular code works. Is this not there? Huh? Okay. Okay, now that I am not logged off, entering login functionality. So it is going to take the information that I have given in the given in the main file. So the login is success. Proceed to navigation. So the navigation functionality is getting invoked. Search for vendor, display all vendors. Now it does the data scraping, and finally it will do the logout.